Society looks at a man living alone in his 60s or 70s and immediately writes a tragic script for his life. The moment people see an older man eating dinner by himself at a diner, sitting alone on his porch, or walking through a park without a companion, they project their deepest fears onto him. They automatically assume he is broken, lonely, abandoned, and simply waiting out his final days in a house filled with heavy silence and regret. The cultural belief is so deeply ingrained that we cannot fathom a man being on his own at that stage of life without it being a consequence of failure, loss, or overwhelming grief. Take the story of 69-year-old Robert, a retired schoolteacher who spent nearly 4 decades meeting the relentless demands of a career, a marriage, and a busy family household. One sunny afternoon, Robert was sitting peacefully on a quiet park bench, enjoying the warmth of the light and the slow breeze through the trees. A couple walked past his bench, and as they passed, the woman leaned toward her partner and whispered just loud enough for Robert to hear, "Look at him. He must be so miserable living all alone at his age. It's just heartbreaking." Robert didn't get angry. He didn't jump up to defend himself, and he certainly didn't let their pity ruin his afternoon. He simply turned his head, took a slow sip from his thermos of coffee, and smiled to himself. He smiled because he realized something profound. The very thing those strangers viewed as a tragic tragedy was, in reality, his greatest personal victory. They looked at his quiet park bench and saw isolation, but Robert sat there feeling a profound sense of lightness he hadn't experienced since he was a young boy. What society completely fails to understand is that what looks like a tragic loss from the outside is often something entirely different on the inside. For millions of older men, living alone is not a sentence, it is a sanctuary. It is the moment a man finally trades decades of constant noise, emotional negotiation, financial pressure, and social performance for pure, unadulterated peace. They aren't sitting in empty houses wishing for someone to manage. They are sitting in quiet spaces, finally enjoying the freedom to exist entirely on their own terms, at their own pace, without having to answer to a single soul. There is a massive difference between being lonely and being selective, but society constantly mixes the two together. When a younger man walks into an empty house, the quiet often feels heavy, uncomfortable, and almost unbearable. Younger men will immediately turn on the television, play music in the background, check their phones every 2 minutes, or rush out to meet friends just to avoid being alone with their own thoughts. In youth, silence feels like an empty void that needs to be filled, because quietness forces a man to sit face to face with his anxieties, his ambitions, and his unanswered questions. When a man reaches his 60s or 70s, his relationship with silence changes completely. He no longer runs away from quiet rooms. He actively runs toward them because he has learned that real silence heals the mind. After 50 years of managing high-stress careers, paying mortgages, raising children, keeping peace in relationships, and satisfying endless social obligations, an older man's brain has been subjected to decades of non-stop noise. By the time he reaches this stage of life, he isn't isolated out of weakness or rejection. He is intentionally selective about what and who he lets into his space. An older man who lives alone and enjoys his solitude doesn't leave the TV blaring all day just to create fake company. He doesn't panic when his phone stays quiet for hours. Instead, he welcomes the stillness because he recognizes that solitude is the ultimate rest for a weary nervous system. Psychological research shows that when a person deliberately chooses solitude rather than having it forced upon them, their body undergoes a physical transformation. The constant flood of stress hormones drops, the heart rate steadies, and the mind finally gets the breathing room it needs to think with absolute clarity. Being selective means that an older man values his peace far more than superficial company. He would rather sit in a quiet room drinking a warm cup of coffee by himself than sit in a noisy room filled with forced small talk, unnecessary drama, or emotional clutter. He isn't bitter, and he hasn't given up on people. He has simply reached a point in his life where he fully understands the value of his own energy. He guards his quiet time fiercely because he spent a lifetime earning the right to live in peace. And he knows that true contentment doesn't come from a crowd. It comes from being completely at ease with oneself. From the time a man enters adulthood, society places an invisible, relentless weight on his shoulders. For over 40 or 50 years, he is expected to constantly perform. He is told that his worth as a human being is tied directly to his ability to earn more money, provide for others, keep the household secure, and solve every single problem that comes his way. He has to play the tough guy when things get hard, hide his own fatigue, and absorb the stress of everyone around him. On top of the financial and physical demands, he is expected to constantly navigate complex emotional dynamics, balancing what he feels with what everyone else needs from him. It is a non-stop act of balancing expectations, and doing that every single day for half a century becomes utterly exhausting. Living alone in his 60s or 70s strips that heavy armor off completely. For the first time in his entire life, the stage lights are turned off, the audience is gone, and the performance is finally over. The moment an older man steps into a home that belongs entirely to him, the pressure to prove himself vanishes into thin air. He doesn't have to put on a brave face. He doesn't have to defend his decisions, and he doesn't have to explain why he wants to sit quietly for 2 hours doing absolutely nothing. There is no one there to judge his choices, critique his habits, or demand his energy. This isn't about disliking women or rejecting relationships. It is simply that he has outgrown the need to constantly negotiate his daily existence. When a man reaches a certain age, the desire to seek approval from the outside world simply dies off, replaced by a deep desire for internal peace. He no longer cares about looking successful, keeping up with social standards, or walking on eggshells to manage someone else's unpredictable mood. Living alone allows him to exist in a state of total emotional authenticity. He cooks what he wants, sleeps when he is tired, speaks when he has something to say, and enjoys silence when he doesn't. That radical freedom from constant performance provides a profound sense of relief that most younger men cannot even fathom. This emotional rest isn't just a mental luxury, it causes a massive positive shift in his physical health. Decades of chronic pressure and emotional performance keep the body in a subtle, constant state of fight or flight, driving up blood pressure and straining the cardiovascular system. When that pressure is permanently removed, the body finally drops out of survival mode. Studies show that when older adults experience true emotional freedom and reduced daily stress, their heart health improves dramatically, their sleep becomes far deeper and more restorative, and their mental clarity sharpens. He sleeps better not because the room is quieter, but because his mind is finally at rest, free from the heavy obligation of pleasing the world. The moment a senior man decides to live on his own, his family and adult children often fall into a complete state of panic. The immediate assumption is that an older man left to his own devices will collapse into chaos, that he will survive on junk food, forget to take his daily medications, let the house turn into a mess, and completely neglect his physical health. Society has trained us to believe that men are naturally incapable of looking after themselves in their later years without a partner to manage their lives. But the surprising reality for millions of independent older men is the exact opposite. Living alone often triggers the best physical and mental health of their entire adult lives. When an older man takes full ownership of his daily environment, the rigid, demanding schedules of the past completely melt away. For decades, his eating habits, wake-up times, and resting hours were dictated by work shifts, family demands, and other people's routines. Living alone allows him to personalize his entire life around what his own body actually needs. He eats when he is genuinely hungry, rather than forcing a meal just because the clock says it's dinner time. He rests when his body feels tired, and he moves when he feels energized. That total autonomy turns healthcare from a nagging chore into a deeply rewarding daily rhythm. Consider Robert's experience after he moved into his own space. At first, his family worried constantly, checking in to see if he was eating proper meals. But without the noise and distractions of a crowded household, Robert began listening to his body for the very first time. He started walking every morning, just 20 minutes at first, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet streets, which naturally grew into a full hour of daily exercise. He began cooking simple, fresh, and wholesome meals that made him feel good, cutting out the heavy, processed foods he used to eat out of convenience or social habit. Within 6 months, Robert lost weight, his blood pressure dropped into a healthy range, and he was sleeping deeper than he had in 30 years. Independence doesn't breed neglect, it inspires a fierce sense of self-reliance and self-respect. When a man knows that his health, his strength, and his longevity rest entirely in his own hands, he steps up to the plate. He takes pride in keeping his living space clean, preparing fresh food, and keeping his mind sharp. Total control over his sleep, his diet, and his physical movement restores his confidence and vitality. Far from deteriorating in isolation, an older man living on his own often discovers that true independence is the ultimate key to living a healthier, stronger, and longer life. One of the biggest misconceptions about older men who live alone is the idea that their lives are completely devoid of love and connection. People see an empty master bedroom or a quiet dining table and instantly jump to the conclusion that the man living there is emotionally starved, isolated, and cut off from the human heart. But living alone does not mean living without love. It simply means that love changes its shape as a man matures. In youth, love is often loud, intense, demanding, and bound up in complex expectations, romantic fireworks, and shared domestic living. As a man moves into his 60s, 70s, and beyond, his need for theatrical, high-maintenance romance fades, making way for a much deeper, far more stable, and beautifully low-drama form of human connection. An older man living on his own proves every single day that you do not need a live-in partner or a marriage certificate to lead a deeply fulfilled, emotionally connected life. Instead of pouring all his energy into a single, high-pressure relationship, he spreads his connection out into the world around him in meaningful, intentional ways. He builds rich, enduring friendships with men and women who respect his space and share his values. These are connections built on shared memories, honest conversations over coffee, mutual support, and laughter, free from the constant friction, emotional negotiations, and daily compromises that so often strain cohabitating couples. Far from closing himself off, an independent older man often becomes a pillar of warmth and wisdom for those around him. Free from the exhaustion of maintaining a complex domestic performance at home, he actually has more emotional energy to invest in others. He builds deep, unconditional bonds with his adult children and grandchildren, showing up as a present, calm, and dependable anchor in their lives. He pours his decades of hard-won life experience into mentoring younger men at work or in his neighborhood, guiding them through the very storms he survived. He contributes to his local community, volunteers his time, checks in on neighbors, or participates in local clubs where genuine camaraderie thrives naturally. Society has been conditioned to confuse the absence of a romantic partner with total emotional emptiness, but that is a deeply flawed perspective. Connection does not require cohabitation to be real, powerful, and life-giving. An older man who lives alone can experience rich affection, laughter, companionship, and genuine care without having to sacrifice his personal sanctuary at the end of the day. He gets to enjoy the absolute best of both worlds: rich, meaningful human relationships when he steps out into the world, and absolute, uninterrupted peace when he steps back inside his own front door. As a man enters his late 60s and 70s, a profound mental shift takes place. His tolerance for unnecessary drama completely vanishes. When you realize you have far more years behind you than you do ahead of you, time suddenly becomes the most precious currency in existence. An older man stops wasting his precious hours on pointless arguments, petty power struggles, toxic relationships, or trying to fix things that are fundamentally broken. He realizes that living entirely at his own pace is not just a nice convenience, it is the ultimate luxury in a chaotic world. There is a massive fundamental difference between forced isolation and intentional solitude, and society constantly mixes the two up. Forced isolation is a painful burden where a person feels discarded and desperate for company, while intentional solitude is a deliberate, empowering choice. When an older man chooses to live alone, he is not surrendering to life, withdrawing in defeat, or hiding from the world. He is making a conscious, powerful decision to set strong boundaries around his personal space and build a sanctuary where his mind can finally breathe without constant interruption or stress. For decades, his mornings were dictated by blaring alarm clocks, packed schedules, demanding bosses, screaming kids, and the endless pressure to manage everyone else's emotions before tackling his own. Living alone flips that script entirely, giving him absolute authority over his daily existence. The ultimate reward after surviving decades of life's heavy demands is remarkably simple, yet immensely powerful. Waking up in a silent home, watching the sun come up over a hot cup of coffee, and knowing that every single decision made that day is entirely his own. There is no one to negotiate with, no one to appease, and no one to walk on eggshells around. Protecting your peace in later life is the greatest act of self-respect a man can cultivate. It means choosing quiet mornings over petty conflicts, emotional stability over constant volatility, and genuine self-fulfillment over society's outdated expectations. Living alone allows a man to step off the continuous treadmill of performance and simply exist in his truest form. It isn't a tragic ending to a story, it is the glorious, well-earned chapter where a man finally takes full control over his own narrative, living with dignity, total freedom, and an unshakable sense of inner quiet.